prepared to die.
With this assurance that I shall lead an endless life with them in peace.
On the morning of the 19th of May, in the year 1536, a woman who had once stood at the pinnacle of English power walked to her death with a calmness so unnatural that it sent a chill through every witness present. Her name was Anne Boleyn. She was Queen of England, crowned, anointed, once adored and feared. But on that morning, she was simply the first queen in the nation's history to face the executioner's blade. Yet the tragedy of Anne Boleyn does not lie solely in her beheading, nor even in the charges that sent her to the scaffold. Her death was not just a royal fall from grace. It was the final act of a psychological war, so meticulously crafted, so methodically deployed, that by the time the sword came down, the woman it struck was no longer whole. Anne was not destroyed by knives or iron. Her execution was merely symbolic, a brutal punctuation at the end of a sentence that had already bled her dry. The true killing was carried out over 17 days, 17 long. Carefully controlled days where the aim was not only to condemn her, but to shatter her sense of identity. Her dignity, her belief in truth, and even her faith in those she once loved. Her enemies did not break her body with chains. They broke her mind with silence, with uncertainty, with rumors whispered in the dark. They crafted a world where every glance could be betrayal, every silence a confirmation of guilt, every remembered moment a lie. And all of it was orchestrated by the very man who once vowed to break kingdoms to make her Queen King Henry VIII. It began with small, calculated moves. A musician arrested in the night, a courtier pulled from a royal procession, an interrogation here, a whisper there. Then, suddenly, Anne found herself surrounded by silence. The men she trusted most had vanished. Her brother, her friends, her household, one by one, they disappeared. And no one told her why. She asked for answers and was met with deflections. She asked for her daughter and was told she could not see her. She begged for her chaplain and was given strangers instead. Women handpicked not to comfort, but to report. Even her own aunt stood watch over her, not as family, but as the crown's eyes and ears. They placed her in the very same apartments where she had once prepared for her coronation, as if to mock her ascent by mirroring it with her downfall. The tapestries still hung, the furniture was unchanged, but nothing was hers anymore, not the bed, not the silence, not even her own thoughts. Every gesture she made was documented. Every word she spoke was passed along to Thomas Cromwell. And in this suffocating imitation of royal comfort, Anne Boleyn began to unravel, not because she was weak, but because the psychological design was too perfect, too total, too insidious to escape. She was told nothing concrete, only hints. They let her know that charges had been made, that men had confessed, that the king no longer defended her. They never told her what exactly had been said. They never showed her the evidence. And that was the point, to trap her in a spiral of doubt, to make her question her memories, her relationships, even her own nature. Had she laughed too freely with a courtier? Had a gift been misunderstood? Was her brother? Could it be? The accusations were grotesque: adultery with multiple men, incest with her own brother, conspiracy to murder the king, but even more devastating was the way they were weaponized, not in court, but in her own thoughts. She was not just imprisoned. She was gaslit into questioning whether she had somehow authored her own ruin. Each day, she was given small flickers of false hope, a possible pardon, a whispered rumor of clemency, the suggestion that if she confessed or cooperated, she might live, and then the hope would be withdrawn. The game repeated, up and down, until she could no longer tell the difference between grace and cruelty. And all the while, time dragged on, not toward resolution, but toward obliteration, toward the slow annihilation of a woman who had once defied popes, outwitted kings, and captured the imagination of a nation. Anne's fall was not designed simply to remove a queen. It was designed to destroy the woman beneath the crown. And it worked. When the trial finally came, it was a farce led by her own uncle, filled with men who had profited from her rise and now fed upon her downfall. The verdict was predetermined, but by then, Anne had already been hollowed out. She had been made to sign the annulment of her own marriage. She had accepted that her daughter would be declared illegitimate. She no longer fought. She no longer protested. And when she stood before the crowd on the scaffold, she spoke not of innocence or vengeance, but of loyalty and mercy, not because she believed it, but because that was the last mask they allowed her to wear. And so, Anne Boleyn did not die with a scream. She died in silence. A silence forged by 17 days of slow, deliberate torment. A silence that echoed not only through the tower but through the centuries. Because her story is not just a cautionary tale, it is a blueprint, a case study in how power can turn identity into a weapon, how psychological warfare can break even the brightest flame, and how tyranny does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, but this is only the beginning. To understand the full machinery behind Anne's destruction, to see how court politics, foreign diplomacy, religious tension, and Henry's obsession with a new woman all converged into one monstrous design, we must step back in time, to the first cracks that appeared before the fall. Because Anne Boleyn's execution was not an act of rage, it was a plan. And in part 2, the trap, we'll see how that plan began quietly, invisibly, months before the first accusation was ever spoken. Long before the doors of the Tower of London closed behind Anne Boleyn, long before Mark Smeaton uttered a word under pressure, and long before the shadow of the executioner's sword ever brushed against the morning air of May, the trap had already been set not by chaos, not by some sudden burst of royal rage, but by something far colder, far more deliberate, a sequence of moves that had been quietly unfolding behind velvet drapes and beneath the surface of courtly smiles. This was not an impulsive collapse. It was a blueprint, an unraveling that began not with a scream, but with a subtle shift in the balance of favor, a quiet closing of doors, and a slow turning of eyes away from the Queen. By the early months of the year 1536, Anne Boleyn's position, though still gilded by her crown, had begun to teeter not from external threats alone, but from within the very heart of the court that once had cheered her rise. Her power, once so sharp and clear, had begun to cloud under the weight of expectation unmet, of alliances frayed, of a king whose gaze no longer lingered, her influence rooted in Henry's passion, in her unmatched intellect, in the singular ability to charm and challenge him in equal measure, was eroding under pressures that she could no longer control. And yet, she remained unaware of just how far the currents had turned against her. For in the Tudor court, power did not vanish overnight. It dissolved quietly, with soft betrayals, and with secrets exchanged over wine in rooms where she no longer entered. The failure to produce a living male heir haunted Anne's every breath. Her body, which had once been a vessel of hope and prophecy, had become the object of bitter speculation and disappointed prophecy. A miscarriage in January, a child, some say was male, had been met not with mourning, but with grim silence, as though Anne's womb itself had betrayed the crown. And for Henry, a man whose dynastic obsession knew no moral limit, the loss of a son was not only a grief, but an accusation. His patience, which had once moved him to defy the Pope and the Church and the entire Catholic world, was now turning into irritation. His eye, once so fixed upon Anne that it had reshaped the laws of England, was now drifting elsewhere to a quieter woman, to Jane Seymour, who spoke little, knelt often, and whose very docility seemed to Henry like the balm for the wounds Anne's fire had burned into his pride. And here, into this churning court, stepped the architect of Anne's undoing, Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, a man of sharp angles and sharper intent, whose genius lay not in the spectacle of politics, but in the machinery beneath it. Cromwell had once been Anne's ally, united with her in the campaign to break with Rome, to usher in a new English order, but now their visions had diverged. Anne, ever passionate, ever driven by conviction, had begun to oppose his policies, particularly his plans for the dissolution of monasteries and the redistribution of church wealth. She had argued that the proceeds should be used for charitable and educational purposes, not simply poured into the crown's coffers. And in doing so, she had made an enemy of the most calculating man in the realm. Cromwell did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply began to move. The politics of the moment favoured him. The international stage was shifting, and Anne, once seen as a diplomatic asset, was increasingly a liability. The Emperor Charles, nephew of Catherine of Aragon, was pressing for renewed ties with England. The French, once willing to support Anne as a counterbalance to Spanish power, had grown cautious, and Jane Seymour, quietly supported by her ambitious family, represented a path of less resistance for foreign alliances and domestic calm. All that remained was for Anne to be removed, not just from the throne, but from history itself, and for Cromwell. That meant not just her death, but her erasure. The first move came in whispers. A conversation between musicians, a name spoken in a corridor. Mark Smeaton, a court musician of low birth and easy vulnerability, was arrested at his lodgings. He was questioned, possibly tortured, certainly coerced, and in time he confessed to adultery with the Queen. It was absurd. It was impossible. But it was useful, because once one name had been spoken, others could follow. One confession became the seed from which a whole architecture of treason could be grown. And Cromwell, with all his legal ingenuity, began to construct a narrative so elaborate and devastating that it would not merely destroy Anne, it would annihilate the entire circle around her, ensuring that no voice could rise in her defense. Within hours, others were arrested. Sir Henry Norris, one of the king's closest companions, was taken during a May Day tournament, seized in full view of the court to send a message that no one, not even the king's friend, was untouchable. Then William Brereton. Then Sir Francis Weston. Then, most devastatingly, George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, accused not only of treason but of incest. The charge was monstrous, calculated to elicit revulsion and horror, designed not only to criminalize, but to dehumanize. And Anne, still unaware of the storm gathering around her, still dressed as queen, still praying with her ladies, did not yet know that the world had already shifted beneath her feet. The timing was surgical. By the second day of May, Anne was summoned before the Privy Council. The men who greeted her were not strangers but former allies. Men she had dined with, laughed with, trusted. And now they accused her not of missteps, not of political errors, but of the gravest crimes a queen could face: adultery, incest, conspiracy to murder the king. The words struck not only at her heart, but at the very foundations of monarchy, of motherhood, of sanctity. Her initial reaction, as recorded by witnesses, veered between incredulous laughter and stunned disbelief. She demanded evidence, but there was none. Only confessions. They said, only truth, already sealed and signed. She was arrested immediately and ordered to the Tower of London. No time to gather her things. No farewell to her daughter. No explanation to her household. The journey there, along the same river she had sailed in triumph for her coronation only 3 years earlier, was a mirror turned dark. Where there had been cheering crowds, there was now silence. Where there had been music, now only oars. And waiting for her in the tower was Sir William Kingston, a bureaucrat with a scribe's precision, who would become the chronicler of her unravelling. From that moment forward, every movement Anne made, every word she spoke, every flicker of doubt or hope was observed, recorded, reported. Her rooms were not a dungeon but a gilded cage, the same apartments she had once occupied as queen, now repurposed as the theatre of her psychological dismantling. She was not alone, but she had no friends. Her attendants were spies. Her comforts were reminders of what had been lost. Even her own family had turned silent. Some complicit, some afraid. And as the walls closed in, Anne Boleyn, the woman who had redefined what a queen could be, began to face a reality in which nothing was solid anymore. Not memory, not loyalty, not even the self. But the trap had not yet sprung. This was only the tightening of its jaws. The days that followed would bring new depths of isolation, new layers of manipulation, and new tactics designed not merely to convict her, but to break her. And in part 3, the walls begin to speak. We will enter the tower with her. We will hear what she heard, see what she saw, and come to understand just how methodical the process of mental destruction can be when it is carried out by the machinery of a crown. Anne had not yet confessed. She had not yet wept. But she had begun to question, and in the court of Henry VIII, that was always the first sign that the end was near. The Tower of London was never just a prison. It was a performance space, a stage upon which the monarchy could rehearse its darkest rituals beneath a shroud of law and silence. And when Anne Boleyn stepped through its gates for the second time in her life, the meaning of the stones around her changed. The last time she had passed beneath that same portcullis, she was a woman rising into legend, preparing for her coronation. A queen to be with garlands in her path, and a crown hovering above her brow. Now, in the 2nd of May, in the year 1536, she was no longer ascending toward glory, but descending into silence. With only shadows waiting to receive her, the tower was ready, and its walls had been listening long before she arrived. Her arrival was not met with open cruelty, but with something far more disorienting, courteous indifference. Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, greeted her not with chains or guards bearing iron restraints, but with a formal stiffness, as if she were still royalty, as if the charges read against her had not transformed her from sovereign to suspect. He led her not to a cell but to the Queen's lodgings, lavish rooms reserved for high-status prisoners. Rooms she herself had once walked through in triumph. The irony was too exact to be accidental. She was not thrown into the tower's dungeons. She was returned to a memory, forced to live within the ghost of her own glory, where every tapestry and carved panel whispered, "This used to be yours." Anne's confusion upon arrival was immediate and visible. She asked questions no one would answer. She paced rooms that once sang her name. She sat on the same cushions where she had once dreamed of ruling alongside her husband, and now found herself awaiting orders she did not understand. Her mind, always sharp, always dangerous, had not yet broken, but it had begun to blur, because nothing around her made sense. If she was truly guilty of treason, Why was she still treated with the outward respect of a queen? If she was innocent, why had she been dragged here in silence? If she still had the king's favour, why had he sent no message? But of course, it was the lack of answers that made the questions themselves a weapon. Thomas Cromwell had designed the trap well. He knew that clarity was a mercy, and Anne would receive none. From the moment she entered the tower, her psychological isolation became absolute. Her ladies-in-waiting were not of her choosing. They were women loyal to the crown, assigned not to comfort but to observe. Among them was Lady Kingston, the wife of the constable, and more pointedly, Lady Shelton, Anne's own aunt, placed at her side, not as a gesture of kindness but as a cruel reminder that blood was no protection in a court where survival depended on silence. These women reported everything: Anne's words, Herr Gestures, her prayers, even her sleep. And every night, Sir William Kingston sent letters to Cromwell detailing the Queen's mental state with the precision of a surgeon charting the decline of a patient he could not save. Anne knew she was being watched. She knew, too, that the women around her were not friends. And yet, she had no one else. She spoke to them because she had no one else to speak to. And so the walls began to speak, not through voices, but through the echo chamber of her own words, repeated back to her in silence, twisted into weapons she would not see until the day of her trial. Her emotions fluctuated wildly, not from instability, but from the unbearable tension of waiting for something, anything that might explain what had gone so terribly wrong. Some days she was composed, asking rational questions, theorizing about court politics, clinging to the belief that the king would intervene. Other days, she laughed at the absurdity of the charges: incest, adultery, murder, and then, moments later, wept uncontrollably, as if some invisible hand had stripped her of all logic. Her captors interpreted these swings as madness, but it was not madness. It was reaction natural, human, reasonable when one's world is taken apart piece by piece. And no one will tell you why. The torment intensified not through violence, but through information denied and information distorted. Anne was told that confessions had been made. She was told that the men arrested with her Norris, Weston, Brereton, and her brother George had admitted to sins too dark to speak. But she was not allowed to see the confessions. She was not allowed to confront her accusers. The names of her supposed lovers were whispered to her, not in accusation but in implication, letting her imagine every stolen glance, every private moment, now twisted and reread through a lens of suspicion. The very familiarity of these names made the betrayal more painful. These were men she had trusted, men who had served in her household, men she had spoken to, danced with, exchanged gifts with. Now she was told they had confessed, but had they? She did not know. And the not knowing was the point. Worse still was the arrival of small, cutting details delivered casually, as though they meant nothing. That the king had not spoken her name, that Jane Seymour now wore a locket with his portrait, that the Seymour family had been moved to royal apartments, that foreign ambassadors already referred to Jane as the next queen. These were not official messages. They were asides, dropped into conversation. I heard in passing, and yet each one carved into Anne's mind more deeply than any royal decree. She was being replaced, Irasid, and yet still forced to live within the title that had once defined her. She still had attendants, still ate from royal dishes, still wore the remnants of royal clothing. But each day, something was taken: a ring, a ribbon, to a privilege, until only the memory of majesty remained. Anne attempted to preserve what fragments of control she could. She prayed. She read scripture. She asked for news of her daughter Elizabeth. She composed letters, most of which were never delivered. In these moments, a part of the Queen returned the Anne who had stood defiant before Rome, who had inspired a king to remake the church, who had given birth to a future monarch. But these flashes were brief. The weight of the unknown, of the unseen, of the unspoken, pressed harder with each passing hour. The longer she remained in that gilded prison, the more the silence began to suffocate her. Then came the interrogations, not brutal, not loud, but calculated. Officials arrived not to accuse her, but to ask questions that led nowhere. They asked about her conversations, her friendships, the gifts she had given. They asked whether she had ever been alone with this man, or in the company of that one. They never said why. They never explained the context. And so Anne was forced to answer honestly about innocent things. While knowing that every honest answer could be twisted into a confession, she became uncertain, not because she lied, but because she began to fear the way truth would be used against her. She asked again to see the charges. Again, she was denied. She asked to write to the king. She was told it was not appropriate. The walls grew closer, the air colder, the silence heavier. By the end of her first week in the tower, Anne Boleyn had not confessed, had not admitted guilt, had not crumbled. But the Queen was beginning to vanish, replaced by a woman who could no longer trust her own memories. This was the genius of Cromwell's strategy. There was no need to torture Anne physically when her world could be manipulated into torturing her instead. Each withheld letter, each familiar face turned away, each rumor allowed to slip through the bars of her confinement was a scalpel, carving away the structure of her identity. And still, she waited for her trial, waited for the king, waited for anything that resembled justice. But the tower would offer no justice, only ritual. And in part 4, the theatre of judgment. The ritual begins. The jury is assembled, the charges are read, and Anne, still grasping for dignity, must stand before a court that has already decided her fate. But before the sword, there would be spectacle, and Anne Boleyn would be forced to play her part in a drama written by men who never intended her to speak the final lines. The walls had spoken. Now the court would pretend to listen. By the time Anne Boleyn stood trial on the 15th day of May, in the year 1536, the outcome had already been written not in ink, but in silence, in staged whispers, in forged confessions and rehearsed betrayals. And though the court summoned the form of justice, dressed in the robes of tradition and cloaked in solemnity, it was not truth they were gathering to hear. It was closure, sanctioned and choreographed, a performance of guilt wrapped in the trappings of royal law. This was not a trial in the true sense. It was a ritual, a theatre, and the Queen was both defendant and centerpiece, brought not to defend herself, but to play a part in a judgment already passed behind doors she would never enter. The setting chosen for the performance was not subtle. Westminster Hall, a place steeped in majesty, history, and crown-bound spectacle. The very hall where Anne had once walked in triumph, as England's newly crowned queen, now repurposed as the chamber of her humiliation. Its vaulted ceilings echoed with the footsteps of nobles and courtiers, not assembled in support, but summoned as witnesses to her unmaking. The symbolism was cold and deliberate. She would fall in the same place she had risen, a circle closed, a crown reversed. A woman turned from sovereign into spectacle. She entered the room not in chains, but with grace. Her posture rigid but proud, her face pale but unyielding, dressed not in rags nor mourning, but in a gown that recalled the dignity she once commanded. And as she walked to her place beneath the gaze of peers who had once toasted her ascent, the silence around her cracked with the weight of so many unsaid things: ambition, jealousy, betrayal, survival. Her judges were not strangers. They were kinsmen, former allies, men who had prospered during her rise and now stood to benefit from her fall. At the head of them sat her own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, presiding not as protector of family, but as executor of political necessity. His voice formal, his eyes averted, as if some part of him still remembered the niece who had once brought such glory to their name. The charges were read aloud in a voice drained of emotion, as though repeating a script that had already been performed in private adultery with 5 men. Conspiracy to murder the king, incest with her brother George, all wrapped together into a single narrative of corruption, so sensational that even the act of hearing it spoken aloud seemed to shift the air in the hall. And yet, beneath the outrageousness of the accusations lay a deeper truth they had not been constructed to convince, but to overwhelm. The spectacle was not in the evidence, but in its volume. The prosecution did not need to prove her guilt. They only needed to bury her beneath it. Anne listened. She did not cry out. She did not plead. When invited to answer, she stood and spoke with a voice that, though softened by confinement and fatigue, still carried the clarity of conviction. She denied every charge. She did not flinch when her brother's name was read. She did not falter when the list of supposed lovers spilled from the lips of her accusers. She answered plainly, with the precision of a woman who understood how fragile the threads of truth had become. But she also knew, perhaps, had always known, that no reply she gave would matter. The court had not gathered to be persuaded. It had come to bear witness to her ruin. Those who observed her that day described her as composed, pale, at times sorrowful, but never broken. And yet the performance unfolded without pause, without disruption, and without mercy. Witnesses were brought forth, their words rehearsed, their meanings stretched. Letters, glances, conversations from years past were resurrected and reframed. One man spoke of her giving a gift. Another recalled her laughing too warmly. A third remembered her being alone in a garden. These were the bricks from which Cromwell's wall had been built, not actions of betrayal, but gestures of courtly life, reinterpreted through the lens of accusation, weaponized not for their substance, but for the story they could serve. The most grotesque moment came with the charge of incest. George Boleyn, Lord Ruxford, was tried separately, but the implications of his supposed guilt spilled into Anne's trial, like poison into clear water. That a sister could be accused of lying with her own brother was not merely slander, it was character assassination on a biblical scale, designed to strip her of all human decency, to render her not just guilty, but monstrous. The court did not require proof, it required horror, and in this, Cromwell succeeded. By accusing Anne not only of infidelity but of perversion, he ensured that even those who doubted her guilt would hesitate to defend her too loudly. And still, Anne stood. And still, she answered, her intelligence had not deserted her, nor her courage. She asked questions. She challenged inconsistencies. She reminded the court of her service, her sacrifices, the legitimacy of her daughter. But for every truth she spoke, the machine answered with silence. The peers who sat in judgment had been chosen for their compliance. Their loyalty was not to fairness, but to survival. They knew that to exonerate Anne was to accuse the king of error. And in a court ruled by fear and favour, no man would risk becoming the next name, whispered behind the doors of Cromwell's office. The deliberation, such as it was, lasted only a few moments. The verdict was unanimous. Anne Boleyn was declared guilty on all charges. The sentence, death by burning or beheading, to be determined by the king's pleasure, was read aloud as if it were law. Not decree. She did not cry. She did not collapse. She bowed her head and thanked the court for its consideration. It was, in its way, the most powerful moment of the day, not because it redeemed her, but because it exposed the farce for what it was. A queen had been judged, but not by truth, not by justice. She had been judged by necessity. After the sentence, she was returned to the tower. The procession did not cheer. The lords did not linger. The audience dissolved, leaving behind only echoes. And Anne, to now officially condemned, returned not to a dungeon, but to the same rooms she had entered 13 days earlier, a place that had once been the threshold to her coronation, and now had become the waiting room for her death. There, alone, except for the eyes that never stopped watching her, she waited. The verdict was final, but the execution not yet scheduled. Time, once, so precious, became elastic. Some nights she wept. Some nights she prayed. Some nights she simply stared into the darkness, whispering to herself the names of those she had loved and lost. George, Elizabeth, Henry. Even still, she knew her life was ending, but it was the silence, not the sword, that undid her. In the days that followed, the machinery continued to turn. The men accused with her were executed, 2 days later beheaded, buried without ceremony, their names carved into nothing. The court began preparations for a new queen. Jane Seymour was cloistered, watched, protected, her future assured. The public, confused but silent, accepted the verdict with the dull resignation of a nation long accustomed to royal caprice. And, meanwhile, remained in limbo, her death sentence suspended, her dignity eroded, her voice stolen not by fear, but by design. But she would speak again. In Part 5, the death that crowned a dynasty, the sword finally falls, and with it, a queen becomes a ghost. But before her breath escapes her body, Anne Boleyn will give one final performance on the scaffold, beneath the open sky, before the eyes of the very court that had watched her rise and orchestrated her fall. For in this theatre of judgment, death is not the end. It is the encore, and Anne Boleyn, though broken, still understands the power of a final act. The morning of the 19th of May, in the year 1536, began like all others had for Anne Boleyn since her fall, with pale light seeping through the narrow windows of the tower's queen's lodgings, and footsteps in the corridor that never came gently, and voices behind doors that never spoke her name with kindness anymore. Yet this morning held a different weight. There was no more ambiguity. No more delay. No more hope wrapped in the whispers of ladies or the sermons of obedient priests. This morning, the sword was coming. The performance was over. The Queen was going to die. It had been 17 days since she was arrested. 17 days since the world she had helped reshape turned its back and began dismantling her legacy brick by brick. 17 days of silence from Henry. 17 days of games played with her soul. She had been sentenced 4 days earlier, but the execution had been postponed. First, because the French executioner had not yet arrived, and then, perhaps more cruelly, because it served the narrative better to let her wait. A woman condemned to die quickly might stir pity. A woman left to ponder her death, to wear it like a crown of thorns, for days on end, would be reduced to a whisper harmless, forgettable, small. But Anne Boleyn had never been small, and she would not begin shrinking now. The French executioner, Jean Rambaud, had arrived the night before, silent and efficient, the bringer of a supposedly more merciful death, as if the sharpness of a foreign sword could erase the ugliness of a domestic betrayal. He had been chosen not only for his skill, but for what he represented: Henry's magnanimity. The king would not burn her. He would not allow the spectacle of fire, or the screams of agony. He would, instead, gift her silence a clean cut, a fast end, and a well-rehearsed goodbye. At dawn, Anne arose. She dressed herself. She chose a gown of dark grey damask with crimson sleeves, and a gable hood that framed her face like a reliquary window, half shadow, half defiance. Her body was pale, her features sharpened by fasting and fear, but there remained in her eyes a strange clarity, as though the layers had been peeled away, and beneath them there was only the steel of finality. She did not tremble. She did not speak of dreams or regrets. She simply asked her attendants to pray, and to stay silent when the time came. Silence, after all, had become the only language the court respected. She was led from her apartments through the Tower grounds, where a small scaffold had been constructed on Tower Green Private. Controlled, selected precisely because it allowed the Crown to shape the story and manage the audience. Only a few witnesses were present: courtiers, officials, hand-picked ladies, the executioner, and the cold May sky. It was not a spectacle for the people. It was a ritual for the state. Anne, once crowned with music and rose petals, now mounted the same steps upon which others had died without titles, without ceremony, without legacy. But she brought her own kind of crown that day, one carved not from gold, but from memory and flame. Before her stood the blockless platform, the French style of execution, requiring her to kneel without support, to hold still and trust the blade would find her swiftly. The executioner stood to her side, silent, gloved, waiting for her signal. The moment belonged to her, and she took it. She turned to those assembled. Her voice was quiet, but the silence around her made it thunder. She spoke not to plead innocence, nor to protest injustice. She spoke to release them all from fear, from guilt, from the burden of knowing the truth. She praised the king. She prayed for his soul. She asked God to be merciful to her own. And in that final act of obedience, she did the one thing her enemies had not anticipated. She took back the story. By choosing grace, by refusing bitterness, by standing not as a victim, but as a witness, she transformed the scaffold into a throne. Then she removed her headdress. She knelt. Her lips moved in prayer. The executioner asked her to keep still. She did not flinch. In an act of mercy or theatre, he called to his assistant for his sword. A distraction. A final gift of ignorance. And in that moment, as she looked away, the blade fell. There was no scream, only the sound of a body collapsing onto wood, the sudden gasp of those watching, and the wet whisper of blood on the scaffold. Anne Boleyn was dead. Her body was placed in an empty arrow chest. No coffin had been prepared. Her head wrapped in cloth. Her remains carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she was buried hastily, without tomb, without marker, without song. She who had once commanded courts and crowned queenship with controversy now rested beneath stone, her name unspoken in the hours that followed. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would not know for years what had truly happened. Henry married Jane Seymour 10 days later. The country moved on, but the dynasty had shifted. Anne's death was not simply the fall of a woman. It was the sealing of a succession, the political clearing of a path. By her execution, Henry rid himself of the woman who had divided Christendom, alienated the emperor, and failed to bear him a son. And in doing so, he rebranded the Reformation, not as a love story, but as a necessity. The new queen would be soft, silent, unquestioning. And the child, who had once been England's heir, Elizabeth, would now be bastardized, pushed to the margins, her mother's fate written over her cradle like a warning. But history does not always obey kings. Anne's blood did not stain the scaffold in vain. In time, Elizabeth would return, not as a forgotten child, but as a monarch to rival any man who had sat the throne before her. And she would rule for 45 years. A virgin queen like her mother never could be. A woman who learned from absence how to wield presence, who wore silence as armor and memory as weapon. Anne's death crowned a dynasty. Yes, but not in the way her enemies intended. It crowned a legacy. It lit a fuse that burned through decades of male-centered rule, that sparked revolutions of thought, religion, image, and power. And in time, the woman who died on Tower Green was not remembered for adultery or scandal or treason, but for having birthed a future. But that would come later. For now, the world was quiet. The court returned to its dance, the king to his bride, the scribes to their proclamations, the tower to its shadows, and Anne Boleyn, once a queen, now a caution, slipped beneath the earth. But in part 6, the autopsy of a legend, we will open what they tried to keep closed. Because century later, when science dared to peer into the whispers of her death, a different story began to emerge, not one of sin and treason, but of poison, infection, and image. The body they never examined in life was dissected by history itself, and the truth, buried for so long beneath fear, began to rise. They buried her quietly, in haste. Beneath the cold stones of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, her body wrapped not in royal linen, but in old cloth. Her head tucked beside her chest inside a wooden box, meant for arrows. Not queens. There was no state funeral, nor mourning court, no monument carved with name or epitaph. They did not want to remember her. They wanted her gone dismantled not only in body, but in myth, reduced to a cautionary tale, whispered to courtiers who dared to speak too boldly. A symbol of what happens when a woman dares to wield ambition like a sword. And for a time, it worked. Anne Boleyn fell. Her name passed in shame. Her story told in hushed tones. Always with a question. Was she guilty? Was she mad? Did she truly lie with her brother? Was she ever a queen at all? But legends do not rot like flesh. They ferment, and they return when the silence grows too thick. For centuries, her body remained undisturbed beneath the chapel floor, covered by layers of stone and ceremony, while above her, monarchs came and went, each one draped in the very crown. She had once risked everything to give a child. Elizabeth, her daughter, had risen from bastard to legend, had ruled for 45 years, had reshaped England into an empire of fire and literature and dominion, yet had never spoken her mother's name aloud in public, as if the memory of Anne was too dangerous to embrace, too fractured to hold, too soaked in blood to sanctify. And so, Anne remained where they had left her, unknown, unclaimed, unexamined, until the year 1876. It began with restoration. The Victorians, ever enamored with Gothic revival and medieval melancholy, began renovations on the tower and its surrounding chapels. Stones were lifted, floors were relaid, and in the process, bones were found, skeletal remains beneath the chapel, loosely identified, scattered across the centuries. Some matched to known burials. Others left anonymous. Among them lay a woman slender, of fine bone structure, aged in her mid-30s at death, with a clean, precise severing at the neck, and buried near where records claimed Anne Boleyn had been placed. Her remains bore no name, only speculation. Could this be the queen the bones were examined? Notes were made. The skull, fragile and incomplete, suggested grace. The cheekbones high, the jaw delicate, the spine showed no deformity. The limbs were proportioned like those of a courtly woman, someone who had not laboured in the fields. She was short, around 5'3", with fingers long and fine. No one could say for certain. No DNA, no inscription, no official marker confirmed her identity. But the story fit, the location matched, the decapitation was undeniable. And so, in quiet whispers, the label returned Anne. But it was only the beginning. In the centuries that followed, science would evolve. Forensic anthropology, historical medicine, and digital reconstruction would offer new questions. And as the story of Anne Boleyn became legend, once more revived by novels, films, essays, and royal obsession, historians began to ask not just why she died, but how she had lived, and what had been happening to her body long before the blade ever fell. And what they found was disturbing. Reports from her final days recorded by Sir William Kingston. Her jailer described symptoms that went beyond anxiety or spiritual anguish. Anne had complained of severe headaches. She had moments of confusion, of sudden mood changes. She occasionally spoke aloud to no one. She was described as trembling, occasionally laughing inappropriately, and suffering from bouts of insomnia so extreme her ladies believed she might collapse. None of this, on its own, proved madness. But it did raise questions. Then came the testimony of earlier years, that she had miscarried multiple times, that one fetus was described as malformed, that she had periods of extreme fatigue, weight loss, sudden flushes in her skin, and what one ambassador had cruelly called the signs of a woman possessed. These descriptions, when stripped of political venom, began to form a pattern, not of sin, but of sickness. Some historians proposed epilepsy, based on her seizures and sudden emotional shifts. Others suggested an autoimmune disorder, perhaps lupus or Graves' disease, both of which could explain weight changes, eye inflammation, miscarriages, and mental fog. Still, others speculated that her miscarriages were the result of rhesus incompatibility, her body attacking her unborn children due to blood-type conflict. A theory tragically supported by the stillbirth of what may have been a male child in January of 1536, just months before her arrest. And yet one theory lingered darker than the rest. Poison? Not the dramatic kind slipped into goblets with cloaked assassins and whispered oaths, but the slow, court-approved kind. The kind found in cosmetics, in medicine, in beauty. Anne, like many women of her era, used a cosmetic known as Venetian ceruse, a whitening paste applied to the skin to create the prized pale complexion of noble women. It contained white lead, and white lead is deadly. It seeps into the skin, enters the bloodstream, accumulates in bones and organs, and destroys the body from within. It causes tremors, miscarriages, neurological decay, hair loss, and skin sores symptoms, all recorded in whispers and rumours about Anne during her reign. What if the very mask she wore to be queen had been the thing that killed her? What if the legend of Anne Boleyn, the fiery, seductive, ambitious woman who rose from court lady to queen was also the story of a woman poisoned slowly by the image she was forced to uphold. What if her death did not begin with Cromwell's conspiracy, or Henry's rejection, or even the trial, but years earlier, in front of a mirror, as she dipped her fingers into a jar of white paste and painted over her skin, hiding the signs of illness, fear, exhaustion, layering poison over vulnerability until even she could not tell the difference. The autopsy was never official. The bones have since been reinterred. The site sealed once more. The mystery preserved in the name of royal dignity. But the questions remain, and the silence, as always, is telling. Anne Boleyn died on the scaffold, but she began dying long before the sword was raised. She died each time her body betrayed her. Each time a pregnancy ended in blood. Each time she was forced to smile through pain. To perform youth in a court obsessed with airs and appearances. She died in fragments. In mirrors. In miscarriages. In expectations sharpened like daggers. And when her head finally fell, it was not the end of a life. It was the closing of a performance that had begun the day. Henry first looked at her and saw not a woman, but a kingdom. But the curtain does not always fall where the king intends. Because in part 7, the silence that rewrote her story, we step into the centuries that followed, where Anne's name was scrubbed from records, her portraits altered, her legacy fractured, and yet somehow she endured, through her daughter, through legend, through whispers that refused to die. This is not only the story of what they did to her, but of what they tried to hide afterward, because history does not forget. It edits. And Anne Boleyn was never meant to be remembered. But she was. The most dangerous kind of forgetting is the one that pretends to be remembering. It speaks in half-truths, carves out the inconvenient bones, smooths over the screams with a crown and a hymn, and replaces the bleeding woman with a painted ghost that fits more comfortably on the walls of power. And so it was with Anne Boleyn. Her body may have been buried in haste, hidden beneath the stones of a royal chapel, her voice silenced by steel. Her story finished with the falling of a sword. But what followed was not absence. It was something colder, more calculated, more permanent. They did not forget her. They rewrote her. It began immediately, in the vacuum left behind by her execution. The court that once whispered her name with both reverence and suspicion now refused to speak it at all. She was not honored, not mourned, not condemned in open sermons, nor praised in secret. She became a non-person, her queenship erased, as though it had been a hallucination. Her likenesses removed or retouched. Her initials scratched from stone. Her badges chiseled out from ceilings where, just months earlier, they had glittered with pride. Tapestries were taken down. Coins were melted. Records were amended to portray her not as a crowned consort, but as a mistake, best forgotten, a failed experiment in female ambition. Even her own daughter, Elizabeth, was declared illegitimate by Act of Parliament. Her royal blood publicly denied. Her mother's memory buried not in the chapel where her body lay, but in the very law of the realm. Yet in that silence, something strange happened. For silence, left long enough, begins to echo, and the shape of what had been removed began to haunt the very spaces where Anne had once stood. Her enemies had tried to erase her to make room for a new order. Jane Seymour, the demure replacement, Edward, the longed-for son. The court rebalanced around obedience and predictable lineage, but Anne's absence refused to behave. It lingered in the shadows of Elizabeth's childhood, in the cold stares at court, in the prayer books with pages torn out and names scratched away. And in time, those very gaps, Those things no one dared to speak became the foundation of her legend. The first whispers came not from rebels, but from those who remembered the way she had looked at the king not as a subject, but as an equal, from those who remembered how she had argued with bishops, how she had read forbidden books, how she had raised her daughter not to curtsy in fear, but to walk with fire in her eyes. And then came the foreign ambassadors, scribbling coded lines in letters sent across borders, reporting that the king was already regretting her death, that her ghost walked the gardens of Hampton Court, that the tower where she died still carried the scent of roses in winter. These were not facts. They were symptoms, proof that the silence had failed. And when Elizabeth rose to the throne, Anne rose with her. No, the Queen did not speak her mother's name in proclamations. She did not order monuments or rewrite the histories. But she did something far more powerful. She became the living refutation of the lies told about Anne. Where Anne had been painted as hysterical, Elizabeth was composed. Where Anne had been called lustful, Elizabeth proclaimed herself married to her country. Where Anne had died because she could not give England a son, Elizabeth ruled for 4.5 decades without needing one. Every moment of Elizabeth's reign was, in some way, an echo of her mother's unfinished story. Not because she wore Anne's face, but because she wore her strength and perfected it into power. Still, the official histories remained careful. Tudor chroniclers, beholden to the regime that had birthed them, portrayed Anne in conflicting lights. To some, she was a sorceress who bewitched a good king. To others, she was a tragic figure, brought low by ambition and a failure to produce a male heir. Few dared to call her innocent. Fewer still dared to blame Henry. And so, for centuries, the silence was reshaped again and again, not through denial, but through distortion. Anne became what the times needed her to be. A warning, a temptress, a stepping stone to England's golden age, but rarely, if ever, a woman, and certainly not a mother. It was not until the modern age that the silence began to truly crack. As feminist historians entered the archives in the 20th century, as old records were re-examined without the fog of royal politics, and as public interest in Anne surged with the rise of novels, films, and documentaries, a new version of her began to emerge. Not the caricature, but the woman, the girl raised in the Netherlands and France, educated beyond her gender's allowance, the reformer who carried Tyndale's words in her sleeve, the queen who risked everything to birth not just a child, but an entirely new England, and most importantly, the victim not of adultery or madness, but of politics, of masculine fear, of the machinery that grinds down women who dare to speak in rooms where they are only meant to be ornaments. This new Anne was not simple. She was complicated, contradictory, flawed, brave, sharp-toned, and deeply human. And in telling her story with those truths intact, the silence lost its grip. Because silence only survives when it can pretend it is neutral. But Anne's story was never neutral. It was violently shaped, intentionally distorted, carefully weaponized. The silence was not born of indifference. It was born of fear. Fear that her story, told honestly, would reveal too much about the fragility of power, the brutality of kings, and the price of challenging a system built to devour women who rise too high. And so, Century la terre, she returned. In stained glass, in novels, in lectures and documentaries, in the face of Natalie Dormer on screen, in the pen of Hilary Mantel, in the echoing footsteps of every schoolgirl who hears her name and feels, in some inexplicable way, that history once tried to silence someone like her, Anne became not just a queen, but a mirror And that, perhaps, is what terrified them all along. Because in truth, Anne Boleyn had never been merely about Henry, or Elizabeth, or the succession, or even the Reformation. She had been about something larger, about what happens when a woman refuses to accept the role written for her. When she decides that intelligence matters more than obedience, that passion matters more than protocol, that she is not an accessory to someone else's greatness, but the architect of her own. That kind of woman does not go quietly. She is buried. Yes, but not contained. She is rewritten. Yes, but not erased. She is silenced. Yes, but only for a time. Because in Part 8, the myth she made of herself, we will walk into the version of Anne that refused to die, the queen who became myth, the mother who lived through legend, the shadow that haunted every monarch who came after her. What happens when a woman is killed, but her story survives in 1,000 forms, each one shaped by a world not yet ready to face the truth of who she really was? Anne Boleyn may have died at 35, but the silence did not last forever. And the myth she left behind, it learned how to speak. There is a peculiar kind of immortality, reserved not for saints or conquerors, but for the women history tries hardest to forget. They are not preserved in marble or serenaded in hymns, but in rumour, in retelling. In the restless way, their names continue to rise from ash, long after their bodies have been discarded. Anne Boleyn did not choose to become a myth, but the world she lived in made it impossible for her to remain only human. When they took her life, they unleashed a version of her that could not be executed, could not be buried. It could not be silenced, a version sharpened by centuries of fascination and fear. And so she endured, not as the woman who bled on Tower Green, but as a shapeshifter made of story, controversy, and resistance. In the years immediately following her death, the myth of Anne was fragile, whispered through locked doors, tucked into secret pages, carried in the quiet defiance of women who refused to believe she had died for nothing. Her name was still dangerous, still volatile, but the mystery surrounding her execution only deepened the sense that something had gone terribly wrong, that justice had not been served, that perhaps her greatest sin had not been adultery or ambition, but daring to wield a voice sharper than a man's pride. There were those who claimed to have seen her ghost wandering the tower, pale and headless, eternally seeking the truth that was denied her. But perhaps the real haunting came not from her spectre, but from the gaps in the record, the silence in the sermons, the refusal to admit how quickly a queen could be discarded like a pawn in someone else's political game. Anne's myth evolved with each century, molded not just by historians and poets, but by the anxieties and desires of the age. In the Elizabethan period, she was quietly redeemed through her daughter's legacy, her name still unspoken by the Virgin Queen, yet embedded in every decision Elizabeth made to protect herself from the fate that claimed her mother. Under the Stuarts and the Hanoverians, she was used as a weapon against Catholicism, portrayed as a Protestant martyr who died for the English Reformation. Her sins softened, her execution seen as evidence of Rome's cruelty, even though it was Henry, not Rome, who ordered her death. In the Victorian era, Anne became romanticized, fragile, tragic, misunderstood, a woman caught in the gears of a male-dominated court. Her downfall lamented, but still painted with caution, as if ambition itself had been her fatal flaw. And so her myth grew layered, refracted, splintered. In one telling, she is the seductress who bewitched a king and paid the price for her games. In another, she is the reformer who carried the seeds of revolution beneath her bodice, reading banned books and whispering forbidden prayers. In yet another, she is the martyr queen, pure and persecuted, broken only by a jealous husband and a rigged court. None of these versions are entirely true, and none are entirely false. Because Anne Boleyn, the myth is not a lie, it is a survival strategy. It is how she continued to exist in a world that tried to erase her body, her thoughts, her presence. By becoming many things to many people, she became unkillable. And this shape-shifting allowed her to haunt the very institutions that had once declared her unworthy of the crown. But for all the stories told about her, perhaps the most revealing myth is the one she crafted herself. Anne Boleyn understood image. She understood theatre. She understood that in a court where women were traded like treaties and dismissed like gossip, her only weapon was to make herself unforgettable. She controlled her wardrobe, her words, her entrances and exits. She read the room, and she rewrote its rules. She refused to sleep with the king until it suited her. She refused to play the submissive mistress. She demanded a crown, and she got it. In doing so, she became more than a woman. She became an idea, a disruption, a new pattern in a world that only accepted old ones. Even in death, she performed. She chose her final words carefully. She dressed with intention. She met her execution with poise, knowing that every breath, every blink, would be remembered, retold, reinterpreted. She did not cry out. She did not beg. She turned her head and gave the silence everything it needed to begin breaking. In that moment, she controlled the narrative one last time, and it worked. Centuries later, she is still here. In art, in film, in literature, in rebellion. She is played by actresses who give her new accents, new attitudes, new wounds. She is studied in classrooms by girls who wonder how a queen could fall so far so fast. She is whispered in the halls of the tower, not as a warning, but as a promise that truth, once twisted, will always find its way back. Anne Boleyn has become the patron saint of the silenced woman, the inconvenient woman, the woman who dares to interrupt the comfortable rhythm of male power. Her legacy is not clean. It is not gentle. It is not easy to hold. But that is what makes it powerful. Because myths that only comfort are quickly forgotten. The ones that persist are the ones that disturb, that demand re-examination, that refuse to behave. And so Anne's myth lives on. In each feminist essay that reclaims her as more than Henry's victim, in every revisionist historian's attempt to untangle the lies from the truth, in the quiet defiance of a girl reading her story and seeing not a cautionary tale, but a blueprint for resistance. But this myth comes with a cost. Because the more we mythologize Anne, the more we risk losing her again, the real woman, the sharp-tongued strategist, the vulnerable mother, the fallible figure caught between ambition and survival. And perhaps that is the final tragedy, that in order to be remembered, she had to become something else entirely. But maybe, just maybe, she knew that too. Maybe she understood that to die as Anne the Queen meant becoming Anne the myth. And perhaps she trusted that one day someone would return not to paint her as perfect, but to remember her as she was, not a saint, not a witch, not a seductress or a martyr, but a woman who dared, a woman who failed, a woman who changed everything. So now, the storm is past. The voices have dimmed. The tower stands, as it always has, solid stone, weathered walls, a place where time folds in on itself and refuses to let the dead rest too far from the living. You know her name. You have walked through her final days, watched the stage set around her, felt the silence that replaced her, followed the threads of her myth as they curled through centuries like smoke, refusing to vanish. But here, as the hour grows late and the telling slows, We leave behind the noise of politics and prophecy and slip instead into a quieter space, not the courtroom or the scaffold, not the chapel floor or the royal nursery, but something softer. A room with the door closed, a chair by the window, a candle burning low. And in this space, we speak not of Anne Boleyn, the Queen, or the sinner, or the saviour, but of the woman who once lay awake beneath high, carved ceilings, and wondered if she would see her child again before the end. History rarely allows for softness, especially with women like her. It carves in certainty. It prefers names that behave. It records the fall louder than the flight. But Anne did not live quietly, and she did not die cleanly. And yet, even after all this time, it is not the executions or the laws or the politics that echo most clearly. It is the image of a mother who could not protect her daughter, a woman who was watched day and night, who wept into her hands while others listened for evidence, a human being who stood at the center of a storm so large it nearly swallowed her whole, and somehow still left behind enough light for us to see her. This story, like all stories worth telling, is not about perfection. It is about what survives. Anne was not the most beloved queen. She was not the kindest, nor the most patient, nor the most politically cautious. She spoke when she should have been silent. She loved when it was dangerous. She believed in her voice at a time when women were expected to whisper, and in doing so, she left behind a map, not one drawn in ink or etched in law, but one etched in memory, in fire, in refusal. And yet, when we peel back the years, the rumors, the monuments, the retellings, what remains? A woman in a window, watching the river move toward the sea, a mother who never saw her child again, a queen who died, believing she had failed, but whose blood ran in the veins of one of the greatest monarchs the world would ever know. These are not the details that history books prioritize. They are not crowned. They are not gilded, but they are true. And that is enough. Perhaps the quiet tragedy of Anne Boleyn is not that she died too young or too wrongly, but that she died, never knowing she had already won, that the daughter they tried to erase would outlast them all, that her voice, once silenced, would one day be read aloud in classrooms and whispered in towers and stitched into the very fabric of a nation's identity, that the story would not end with the sword. Tonight, as your eyes begin to close and the breath deepens, let this final image rest with you, not the scaffold, not the fear, not the injustice, but the truth behind the myth, that Anne Boleyn was never just the victim, she was the echo that would not fade. She was the fire they tried to drown. She was the question no one could quite answer, no matter how many times they tried to write her out of the ending. And now, she is yours, to remember, to question, to carry. Because stories like hers do not sleep. They wait. And when the silence grows thick again, they rise. Good night, Anne, and good night to those who still listen for the truth between the stones.